In the previous lesson, we talked about responsive scale-based typography. In this lesson, we're going to talk about responsive scale-based spacing. Very similar concepts, but there are a few differences because of how spacing works in web design in particular. So in this video, we're going to talk about how the spacing system in Automatic CSS works and how to apply spacing in real-world projects. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about the controls that you have over spacing, how the spacing system is set up, and then we're going to take a look at what is effectively the anatomy of this layout right here to see exactly how we recommend you apply spacing using Automatic CSS. Then we're going to go over some other ways that you can apply spacing. And this is a little bit tough because we haven't gone into the actual step-by-step workflow, like the recommended workflow, talking about things like BEM and variables versus utility classes and all of that. But we will get there in a future lesson. I just want to stay focused right now on the spacing concepts and how the spacing system works in the framework. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to open the dashboard. I'm already in the spacing tab, but if you're not already in the spacing tab, you're just going to find it on the home screen. Go ahead and click on spacing. You're going to see standard spacing, section spacing, contextual spacing, auto spacing, and smart spacing. A lot of spacing controls, okay? Now, we are going to talk about all of that except for smart spacing. We're going to do an entire lesson dedicated to smart spacing. So we're going to talk about all the others in this lesson right here. And this carries over into padding, section padding, margin, gap, anything related to header, anything related to spacing is going to be found in this lesson. So you can re-reference this lesson in the future if you have a question about spacing. Okay, let's open the standard spacing controls. You're going to see that this is very similar to typography. We have a base value and then we have a scale. Spacing in Automatic CSS uses the t-shirt size system just like typography does. And so we have medium, large, extra, extra large, small, and extra small. Okay, if I adjust the base spacing value, that is going to affect everything. Everything involved with spacing, gaps, margin, padding, section padding, everything is affected by the base value. So I'm going to hold down Shift and hit up on my keyboard, and that's going to go by whole numbers. So it doesn't matter what the decimal is. And I'm just going to go up and down. I just want you to visualize, and that's one reason why we have this layout from frames here, so we can visualize what base spacing is actually doing. As you can see, pretty much everything is affected by this base spacing value. I can freely add more white space or remove white space across an entire website from this one point of control. And I have that control on desktop versus mobile. This again uses clamp functions. This is fluid, responsive spacing. There are no breakpoints to worry about. And so the difference between the minimum and the maximum changes how aggressively the spacing scales across devices. All right, if there's a wider gap between our spacing, it's going to scale more aggressively from desktop down to mobile. So for example, if you like the way that spacing is behaving on desktop, but you feel like maybe there's too much of it on mobile, reduce the minimum value right here. You could go down to something like, and I can just type in a new value, you go down to something like 20, okay? And so now the spacing is going to all tighten up on mobile versus desktop, and then all throughout that range, it's going to tighten up more aggressively, okay? So that's one lever that you have to control spacing on your website, but it's far from the only lever that allows you spacing control. The next thing we talk about is the spacing scale. We talked about how scales work in typography. It works exactly the same with regard to spacing. So we have our different t-shirt sizes. The larger the scale number is, the more variance there is between the sizes, the bigger the jumps are. And then if that scale number gets smaller, the less jump there is between sizes. And so you have another lever that you can control. If you feel like when you have large spacing and you ask for extra large, that the jump between large and extra large is too big, then scale it down, right? Change the scale number and the jumps will not be so big. It'll be much more manageable for you. You'll feel based on your opinion about how the spacing system is working. I see a lot of people go, the jumps are too big, and they don't realize that they actually have control over the jumps, right? This is exactly what the scale does for you. So you can dial this in, and the scale and the base spacing, they're going to work together. So you need to make adjustments to the base and the scale to just dial things in the way that you want. Now let's talk about section spacing. Section spacing, this confuses some people. Why are the controls different, right? Why isn't there a scale? Why, because it all uses the same system. Spacing is spacing is spacing. However, in the context of sections, sections require, typically for good UI and UX practices, more spacing than other containers. And they're also unique in the fact that they have block spacing, that's top and bottom, that is distinctly different from the inline spacing, which is what we call a gutter, right? So the gutter on a website exists over here, and on desktop devices, you can't even see the gutter, right? You can only really see the gutter when the gutter engages on smaller screens. That could be laptops, that could be tablets and mobile devices. So we have a separate control for your website's gutter. This establishes a global gutter. We've already talked about this. And this is where you change it, okay? We did talk about the existence of the gutter. Now we're talking about where you can actually change your gutter. The one thing is, the one thing I don't want you to get confused about is the live preview situation. If I change this number right here, nothing on my screen is going to change. Why? Because the gutter is not big enough to be engaged on a screen of the size of mine, okay? I'm working on a big screen. The gutter does not engage on this screen. The gutter only engages on like a tablet, right? Or a laptop or something like that. Then you're gonna see the gutter value actually affect something. So just to demonstrate this, I'm gonna set this at 100 pixels. And when I save, there's no live preview for this, but when I save, you're gonna see this gutter, okay? This is the real gutter right here. You're gonna see this increase, and that content is gonna come in farther from the edge of the device. So I'm gonna go ahead and hit save. This is gonna regenerate all the style sheets. And as soon as that happens, you're gonna see my new gutter value taking place. Now, as I go down, that gutter is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. Why? Because it's using that minimum value now. The closer you get to the minimum, the more this minimum value is going to go into play. So if I wanted, let's say I think that gutter is still too big for mobile devices. Okay, I'm going to change the min value, the 20, to 10, and I'm going to go ahead and hit save. It's going to regenerate the style sheets, and then we're going to see that content gets even closer to the edge of the screen. Now, just keep in mind where you're previewing. I'm previewing at 477. Once again, I'm going to explain this. I'm going to go back to the layout tab, website dimensions. I'm optimizing for my smallest screen at 360, which means that my minimums, if I go back to spacing, and I go to section spacing, this minimum value and this minimum for base spacing will be exactly that value at 360, not at 477, which I'm looking at right now, okay? So if you're not previewing the minimum, you're not gonna see the minimum. I just wanna make sure you're not confused as to why there's a discrepancy, right? You might say, hey, I'm on my smallest device size. That doesn't look like 10, that looks like more than 10. It is more than 10. It would only be 10 at 360. You're looking at 477 right now. That's where the discrepancy lies, okay? I'm going to go ahead and reset my gutter, and I'm going to go ahead and hit save. You're going to see that my gutter gets a little bit bigger here. Okay, and everything, again, is fluidly responsive. There is no breakpoint management for this stuff in Automatic CSS. It's unnecessary. It's inefficient. You don't want to use breakpoint management. You want to use fluid responsive typography and fluid responsive spacing. Now, let's talk about the base spacing multiplier for section spacing. All we're doing, this is all you have to know, all we're doing is taking your standard base spacing that you said you liked, and we're multiplying it for sections, because sections just demand more spacing. They don't really demand their own like base spacing, scale system, all of that. All of that is just based on your normal spacing system, because section spacing is spacing. It just, for this context, we need more of it. We don't need a whole different system for it. We just need more of the system we already have. And so we're just taking the values here and multiplying them. So my value is 30. And I'm going to say that for sections, I want to multiply that by 3. That would equal 90. So my default section spacing is 90 pixels, top and bottom. The gutter is the gutter. It's always left to be the gutter. That value never changes. It's always going to be the gutter. Okay, so if you just understand this to be a multiple of your base system, that's why it says base spacing multiplier, it's just a multiple of the base system, then you know exactly how this works intuitively out of the box. And all of your section spacing sizes are still based on your spacing scale. Okay, so these are the levers that you can pull. And by the way, Automatic.css is one of the only frameworks I know of to have a section spacing system like this. Most frameworks don't even recognize the value of having section spacing, that context, defined separately from your normal spacing. And once you use section spacing and see how powerful it is, you're gonna be like, why wasn't this thought of before? And exactly, that was how I felt. And that's why I introduced it with Automatic.css. Okay, so that is how you control section spacing. We're going to talk about what does the large do, extra large. We'll get to all of that. Don't worry. What I want to look at now is the anatomy of this section. Let's see how spacing was actually applied, starting at the section level. So I'm going to go open this class, feature section foxtrot. And I've actually cleared out in the actual version of this frame, you'll see a value here for row gap. But you don't see a value here, yet I still have spacing between this container right here and this container right here. Where is that coming from? We talked a little bit about it in the intro video to ACSS 101, but this brings us into talk about automatic spacing and automatic contextual spacing. You see something called an auto container gap, an auto content gap, and an auto grid gap. Where are these values coming from? They're coming from this contextual spacing area right here. Here's where you're defining your container gap, your content gap, and your grid gap. I debated what order am I going to talk about these things in. And I think just looking at the anatomy of a frame is the best way to do this. And as we go into this frame in more detail, you'll see how this starts to break down. But I have automatic container spacing, which means in my section right here, I actually don't even need a value. The minute I add a section, and again, we talked about this in a previous video, the minute I add a section, my containers are already spaced out the way I want them to be. I don't even need a value here. Now, if I wanted to apply a value, I could go to row gap, I could right click, and I could choose a spacing variable to put in. But this is where we have to get into the conversation of, do you want to use these generic spacing variables, or do you want to use a variable that actually has some sort of defined context and meaning? I actually almost always want to use a variable that has meaning in a situation where that context applies. So I would use container gap here. Notice that when I put container gap into this field, nothing happens. I remove it, nothing happens. Why? Because it's already using container gap automatically. That's what the automatic spacing is doing. And as I said in the very beginning, you want these auto spacing controls on. You can change them at any time. Let me demonstrate this. I'm going to click on row gap. Let's say I want to remove this contextual container spacing and just use a normal spacing variable. I'm going to do something like XS. See, and I can even live preview this as I hover these, right? Look at how these are going to change. I'm going to do XS. It puts XS in here. See, was I stopped? Did the auto spacing stop me from doing something I wanted to do? No, absolutely not. It doesn't create any limitations or confinements whatsoever. You are still free to do whatever you want to do. Is it appropriate to use space XS here? Not really, because I'm taking this out of the context of container gap, which you don't want to do. And I'm going to show you why in just a minute when we live preview some of this stuff. You're about to see some magic happen. What we're doing here with the contextual spacing stuff is giving you far greater control, global control, safe global control than you've ever had before on any project whatsoever. You're going to see it in action in just a second. So I understand it can be a little confusing right now following everything, but when you see it happen, instantly it's going to click in your mind. You'll be like, oh, that's why. That's important. Okay, so let's get to it. If I did want to change that value right there, I would want it to stay within the container gap context and just use a calc. Say, hey, I want half of the container gap here. And you're going to see why this applies in just a second. But I'm going to remove that. I'm just also introducing you to the concept of right-clicking on inputs and being able to easily just choose exactly what you want or need. I can also introduce you to the concept of writing a variable and hitting enter and wrapping it. And then perhaps, let's do the calc, container gap times 2. I could say I want double my container gap here. I hit enter. It's going to wrap the var, it's going to wrap the calc, it's going to give me twice the container gap that I had previously. Okay, so this is just the basics of applying these variables with the right-click context menu, with the auto var wrapping, with using calc, tremendous flexibility within the system. Okay, so that's the section level. Now let's go into this first container, which is an intro, and let's activate this class and see what's going on here. Ah, look at this. Again, we have no value whatsoever. But I'm going to go in here and I'm going to apply content gap. And you see that when I apply content gap, now I'm going to remove it, nothing happens. Why? Because the content gap is already being applied for me. It's automatic, right? It's automatic. So why is this content gap and not container gap? Because these things aren't containers. They are content. This is content, this is content, this is content. The space between the content is called a content gap. Same thing down here. I'm going to click on the body wrapper of this content in this card. And ooh, look at this. Now we're going to see this is calling for content gap divided by 2. It's saying, give me content gap here, but half the normal amount. We're staying within the content gap context, but we're just making an adjustment on the fly with a calc based on what we need for this particular card. So this card is using half of the content gap here. So we have, and we see that there's no auto spacing for that. If I remove this, I'm going to get my auto content gap. But as you see, the designer, whatever, felt that that's too much for a card scenario. And so all we're doing is dividing it by 2 and making it smaller, but it's still content gap. It's still living within that context. Now let's take a look at this container right here. And I want to activate feature grid foxtrot and look at this grid gap. It's not space M, space L, space XL. It's a contextual variable. It's saying, yeah, we are using space L or M or whatever it is. We're just using it within a specific context called grid gap. Why? Because this is a grid, and the space between grid items is the gap. So the gap in a grid is called you got it, grid gap. Okay, so these are very easy to understand and memorize, and there's only a few of them. Okay, but now what I want to do is demonstrate why is it abstracted like this? Why aren't we just using, like every other framework, why don't we just use space M here, space M down here, space S here, right? Why are we using these contextual variables? Okay, let's take a look at exactly why we're doing it. I'm going to start with container gap. Let's say I get to the end of my project, and I can be anywhere in my project. I can be at the beginning, I can be in the middle, I can be at the end. It doesn't matter. Why? Because of the context, making adjustments is safe. If you use standard spacing variables everywhere, just M's, 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 L's, 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 S, 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 with no context, and you're not free to adjust things very much anymore. All that you're left with is adjust everything equally, bigger or smaller. But you can't adjust different areas safely, right? Watch me cycle through, and I'm going to show you something about this dashboard input. The dashboard inputs know the system. So if you go up and down with the arrow keys, it's going to cycle through the options, even on variables, okay? And as I cycle through this, look at what's happening. The only thing changing is the gap between my containers in my section. That is the only thing affected. And why is that? Because I'm using container gap right here. Now, let me clear that out. Let's go back to a default. I want to do something we did earlier. This is just helping you understand how these things relate and how these things behave. I'm going to do my container gap again, but I'm going to divide it by 2, like we talked about earlier. And then I'm going to go back to this container gap and I'm going to cycle through. Notice, look at this, huge difference. It's still giving me control, but it's still dividing whatever the value is by 2 because I told it in this scenario, whatever this layout, whatever's going on in this layout, it needs to be half of whatever the default value is, okay? And you see, if I had used, now let me go back here. Let me remove this. Let's say I just said, no, I want to go like space M with it, okay? I like that look. I like space M. Fantastic. Now let's go to the container gap control. Nothing, I've just lost control over that context because I used a variable that is not living within that context. I just used a generic spacing variable. I've lost control over that context. Does that make sense? I want to retain control over these contexts as much as I possibly can. So if I want to make an adjustment to the container gap, I make the adjustment to the container gap and I still have control over it, but within the confines of that calc, which is insanely powerful, right? Okay, so that's how container gap works. Now let me show you content gap. So I'm going to start moving this value to make my content bigger or smaller, right? Notice that the spacing in my intro is changing, but so is the spacing in my cards, but my cards aren't changing as much as the intro is changing. Why is this? Because the intro is using content gap. The cards, if you remember, are using half of content gap. So they're changing by half of the new value. And that's, again, why I can safely increase or decrease spacing in specific areas safely. I know exactly what's going to happen, and it's very, very, very predictable. I'm going to set that back to the default and that back to the default. And then lastly, look at how I'm able to affect spacing within the context of grids safely without messing with anything else in the system. This is more control than any other framework allows. We are on the forefront of introducing this concept of contextual spacing. And once you start using a contextual spacing system, you are never going to want to go back because of the amount of control that it gives you. And when you're going through your build and you're having to choose values for things, all right, I got to apply spacing here. What's the value going to be? Well, remember, in a framework that doesn't even use variables, I mean, people are just throwing out random numbers. And it might even be pixel values, not even accessible, not even nothing. And then in rims, they're like, oh, what's the rim going to be here? What's the rim? Oh, what rim did we use earlier over there? Oh, let's go find out. Let's go look at that rim. Then we'll just use the same rim value here. But if things need to change in the future, you have no control over anything. And then variables get introduced. It's like, that's much better. I can use t-shirt sizes, M, S, L, XL. That makes the decision making really, really good. But still, you have no control over specific contexts. So now you go one step further and start to assign context to things. And now when I'm building, I just say, this is content gap, content gap, content gap, content gap. Oh, I need half my content gap right here, like in this card. And there's really no decisions to make anymore. All the decisions are already made for you. And you're just making granular adjustments here and there, like with a card saying, I want half of that content gap. Or maybe a specific section layout calls for more container gap than you normally use. And so you just say, well, I'm still using container gap. I just want more than we normally use in this scenario. So multiply by 1.5, okay? It's still automatically responsive. It's just giving you exactly what you need within that specific context. Tremendously powerful. And I think seeing the anatomy of a frame like this and playing with the controls, seeing what levers do what, really helps illustrate that. I want to talk about one more thing right here before we move on. The gap between the icon and the content on the right-hand side. I'm going to show you, if I activate this class, very interesting. We're using a standard spacing variable here, space S. Why are we doing that? Let me put this to content gap just so you can see. And even content gap divided by 2 maybe, okay? Because that effectively looks like space S, right? It's about the same thing. So let me open this up and you're going to see why we chose or I chose a static variable there over a contextual variable. I want these things to make sense to you, okay? So let's talk about it. I'm gonna go to content gap and I'm gonna start moving this, my content is getting further away from the icon as I increase that value. Is that desirable? Does that make sense? No, that makes no sense. That you would not really want that to happen. So I can remove, I wouldn't want to use for this column gap, I wouldn't want to use a contextual spacing variable. I actually want that to be static. I want it to be S, regardless of what happens with content gap. I want that gap between the icon and the content to be fixed, to be static, okay? So when I move my content gap now, look at all the content gap adjust, but that gap between my icon and my content does not change. It stays static. So you see how this is actually an additional lever of control where you can say, hey, I want this to be able to adjust within this context, but I want this thing right here to be fixed in place. I want this thing to be static. And that's where I go to a normal spacing variable, a non-contextual spacing variable. So the vast majority of time, you're going to be building with these contextual utilities. And then sometimes you're going to say, no, this needs to be a static thing, or I'm applying spacing outside of any specific context. And then I just go with my normal spacing variables. I want you guys to comment on this video. Am I making this make sense? Am I explaining it well? Or am I confusing you more? I will re-record this video if I need to re-record this video to explain it a different way or to show different examples. Just let me know in the comments if it makes sense and if you can understand and appreciate the additional power and flexibility that this gives you. I know in some cases, until you've actually done it, it might not make 100% sense, but I think that once you start using it and you see how it works and you feel how it works, then it's going to click for you. All right. But comment down below and let me know if all of this is making sense. All right. Another thing that I want to make sure that we touch on is those section padding classes so that you understand those. So I'm going to click on this section right here. It's feature section Foxtrot. Now, feature section Foxtrot uses our normal default section padding. I want, in this one instance, this section to be larger, okay? So I want it to have more block padding, but I don't want to affect my gutter, obviously, okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and use a utility class because in this one situation, I want this section to be larger. So I'm going to search for padding, and you're going to see that I have some padding classes. I wouldn't want to use padding classes because this is a section. And if you apply padding classes, you're going to screw up your gutter. You're going to get normal spacing. Okay. That's not the appropriate context. What is the appropriate context? Section padding. And the new classes, this is maybe new for a lot of you, you might be seeing this for the first time, are just section size. Section M, section S, section XS, section L. It used to be pad section and then the size, but we've recently made this a lot cleaner. So you just need to know what size section do I need? And you can see it's live previewing over here. But let's just say I want an L, okay? So I just put section L on here, and now I suddenly have a large section. And these classes know to only affect the block padding and to leave the gutter alone, right? So that is how section padding classes work and behave. They change the block padding and they leave your gutter to be your gutter because we don't want to change that. We don't want inconsistent gutters across our website. Changing the size of your section is that easy, okay? Again, I want padding. Let's go XXL. Look how big this section is now. And it's just that quick, okay? And so you're able to quickly dial in across your website. Hey, I want this one to be L, this one to be, if it's M, you don't need anything because M is the default. I need this one to be extra small, okay? XS, let's do that. So let's just go in here, padding, section, XS, and now I have XS spacing, section spacing for this particular section right here. Now, what if you did want feature section Foxtrot to always be larger or always be smaller? Well, now on the class, I'm going to go use a variable. I'm going to go to my layout and my padding. You can see the defaults in there. I'm going to right click. And now, do I use space or do I use section space? It's a section. So you need to stay within the context of the section spacing system. At least that's what I would recommend. And so I'm going to do section space XS right here. Bang, bang. And I'm going to get that all the time now on feature section Foxtrot because I've assigned this to a custom class. Now, what if you wanted to remove padding from a section? Well, if you want to remove them from all of these, this class right here, just set the class to 0. And now you don't have any section spacing whatsoever, section padding whatsoever, anytime you use feature section Foxtrot. But what if I wanted to do it in one instance, just that one instance, that's it, okay? So I can do something called section none, all right? And that's gonna give me no padding in that section. Now, did that get rid of my gutter? Did that get rid of my gutter? No. Because just because you don't want any block spacing doesn't mean you don't want or need a gutter, right? If you want or don't need a gutter, watch this, take this off, and you're using a utility class, you're gonna do padding none. Padding none will remove all padding because that's not the section padding system. That's the normal padding system. And you're saying, I want none of it, okay? And now we look down here and you see we have none of it. We have none of it. So I've removed padding completely from this section. Section padding none, or right, section none gets rid of the block padding but leaves your gutter intact. And then padding none literally is no padding, gets rid of all padding, even your gutter, okay? So I wanted you to understand the distinction between those two things. The next thing we need to talk about is gap, okay? So we can apply gap with classes. If I do gap, and I can see that I can go, here's large, right? Extra large. So I can control my gaps. Now you're going to use this less frequently because of contextual spacing, right? You're going to be using grid gap in most cases, or you're going to be using content gap or container gap or what have you. But there are normal gap classes. Just like there are normal margin classes. We haven't talked about margin either. So if I search for margin, I can do margin on the top of this element. I can do margin on the bottom of this element. I can even do margin on the left side or the right side. I have a lot of control when it comes to margin. And what's actually happening here? Margin top M is just applying space M, the space variable. That's it. In variable land, there's just spacing. In class land, you have to define where that spacing is going, margin, padding, etc., right? But I'm going to take that off, and let's say on your intro alpha heading, you actually want to boost the margin on the top a little bit. I can go to style margin top, right click, and just choose a normal spacing variable, okay? Like space S gives me S margin on the top of that element right there. And I would want to do that with the class being active in most cases, okay? Because that would apply to every instance of that heading now. Now, could you, let's talk about this, since that is content, could you say, hey, well, let's put a content gap there, right? Yes, you can absolutely do that. And that may actually be very desirable. It just depends on if the content gap changes, do you want that to continue increasing or decreasing in relation to that? And I would say that since it's content, you probably do. Now, there's no content gap sizes, right? There's not content gap S, content gap L, content gap XL, whatever, but you're free at all times to just come in here, drop a calc in, make that granular adjustment, and just dial it into exactly what is needed for that specific context. The amount of control and flexibility that you get, and this is why I said in the very beginning, that you can finish an automatic CSS website and then still safely go adjust spacing globally in different contexts in seconds. Tighten up that content, loosen up that content, tighten up those grids, loosen up those grids, tighten up those containers, tighten up those sections. All of these differently defined contexts provide tremendous control. That's going to be it for this episode. Again, I don't know. I've been using this system for a long time. It's very fast. It's very easy. I want to make sure I'm explaining it well for you if you're newer. Now, I do want to encourage you, don't just watch the video and determine, okay, did that make sense? Actually dive in. Go open the install, go play around with the different contexts, understand what the contexts mean and how they work, play around with the controls, see the relationship between them, and then maybe build a couple things, and then if it doesn't click, let me know, and I will be happy to re-record this, and I will do it a different way. I'll find a way to teach it to help it make sense for you faster. But all I can do right now is just hope that, I'm not a beginner, right? So I just hope that I'm explaining it in a way that is easy for you to digest. Let me know in the comments. I'll see you in the next lesson.